Department through law enforcement channels. There was some small coordination role between our embassy and the Australian government just in the past few days, but this was, other than that, a law enforcement matter handled through law enforcement channels.
But are you satisfied that the case is over?
So look, the Justice Department has spoken to that, and I don't have anything to add. Obviously, the ambassador put out a statement that said we were happy to work with our Australian colleagues on it, and that remains the case. I do think it is important when we talk about Julian Assange to remind the world that the actions for which he was indicted and for which he has now pled guilty are actions that put the lives of our partners, our allies, and our diplomats at risk, especially those who work in dangerous places like Afghanistan and Iraq. This was some years ago now, almost 15 years ago, so I think the world has forgotten much of it. But if you recall, when WikiLeaks first disseminated and published State Department documents, State Department cables, they did so without redacting names. They just threw them out there for the world to see. And so the documents they published gave identifying information of individuals who were in contact with the State Department. That included opposition leaders, human rights activists around the world, whose positions were put in some danger because of their public disclosure. It also chilled the ability of American personnel to build relationships and have frank conversations with them. And at the time, those of you who covered the State Department at the time will probably remember that in the days leading up to that release, the State Department really had to scramble to get people out of danger, to move them out of harm's way. It was an extraordinary effort performed by dozens of government officials around the world, but that doesn't change the danger that those actions put innocent people all around the world in through no fault of their own. And that's, of course, not even to mention the further actions by WikiLeaks down the road to essentially serve as a conduit for Russian intelligence interfering in the U.S. presidential election.
Sorry, so I actually did cover the State Department back then, and I don't remember there being any public, there was a public concern that was raised about the potential security risk posed to sources who might have been quoted. Was there actually any, did you ever discover anyone who was injured, killed, had to go into hiding because of them?
So a few things about that. One, I can't give you a definitive answer only because I wasn't here at the time and so much time. And
okay,
so, hold on. Matt, let me finish. I have a full answer on it. Okay. One, I can't speak to that because it was some years ago and I don't have a full, accounting of what happened. But number two, the State Department did an extraordinary amount of work when we found out that these cables were going to be published to get people out of harm's way, to go around and look at what might become public and take action so people that would be put in danger would be put out of harm's way. But third, if you drive drunk down the street and get pulled over for drunk driving, the fact that you didn't crash into another car and kill someone doesn't get you out of the reckless actions and the endangerment that you put your fellow citizens in. And it's the same thing, the same principle applies here.
Right. Well, I don't think that it does. But the fact of the matter is that the State Department has been, at least as far as I know, and maybe I'm wrong, but has never been able to point to anyone who was compromised or killed or put at risk because of this.
Their identities were compromised. The State Department went to great work to get people out of harm's way, to prevent that very action from happening.
Do you know how many people about?
As I said, this was some time ago. I was in the government at the time, not at the State Department. I'd have to go back and look at it, but I do know that there was work around the world, especially in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places around the world where they did have to do a great amount of work to kind of move people out of harm's way.
One of your predecessors, P.J. Crowley, who was standing at the podium at the time, went to great pains to talk about the potential damage that could or would be caused by these revelations. And unless I missed it, I didn't hear that there was any.
As I said, number one, the department went to a great amount of effort to avoid people being put in harm's way, but it doesn't absolve anyone of their responsibility. I know, but I know you're not. But it's an important point. Just because people were able to mitigate the harm done by your actions, that doesn't absolve you of your actions in the first place.
Okay.
Shannon, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
One other thing. You said there was some small coordination between the U.S. and Australia over the last couple of days. Was that involving the
Just
flight?
with relation to his landing and transfer in Australia. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up? It said in the
Sure.
agreement that Mr. Assange will not be able to enter the United States without permission. Who will he be seeking permission from? Who would grant that permission, and how would that happen if that were to occur?
It would, so I'm not going to speak to provisions in what was a Justice Department plea agreement, but that would be handled, as is the case for anyone seeking permission to enter the United States.
And in the judgment, the sentencing part of the judgment, the judge noted that there were no victims of Mr. Assange's behaviour, which is part of the reason that the sentence was what it was. Do you disagree with that? Do you think there were victims of his actions?
I'm not going to speak to a comment made by a judge in a ruling. It would never be appropriate for me to do so, but I stand by the comments I made just a moment ago.
What? You're not going to speak to a comment made by a judge. I mean, if he did, I don't know that he did, but that's exactly the point of my question.
Yeah, but I'm not.
Which is that the State Department has never come up, even though it was one of the prime quote unquote victims of these leaks, was never able to identify anyone who was killed or came under.
I think the point I made a moment ago is an appropriate response to that, which is just because the State Department was able to take actions to keep people out of harm's way, people that he put in harm's way, doesn't absolve responsibility.
What actions did the State Department take?
The State Department at the time was able to reach out to individuals whose names were going to be, I can't tell you that, it's almost 15 years ago, Matt, I wasn't here.
Well, I know, the case has just come to a close.
But I cannot give you a full account of something that happened almost 15 years ago, but people that were here will tell you that the State Department went to great lengths to reach out to people whose identities were exposed and get them out of harm's way. And the other point I made is that it does, when something like that happens, it does chill the ability of American personnel to build relationships with people and count on the fact that the information they provide us will be held confidential. So it is not just a harm to, or potential harm to the safety and security of those individuals. It's a harm to American diplomacy.
No doubt, but the fact of the matter is that you have not ever been able to identify anything tangible about any tangible negative effect.
That is a different. So I think I just did point to a tangible negative effect when people are less willing to trust the United States government.
Okay, well, give me an example.
Information's secret.
Who was willing to?
It was I was in government at the time, and I can tell you, traveling the world with a different, a different agency, we often heard from foreign counterparts that they were. I'm obviously not going to speak to. I'm not going to speak to the exact conversations, but we often heard from foreign counterparts that they were worried about providing information to the United States government because of our ability to keep it.
Well, I remember one, having been here at the time, and I remember that Berlusconi told former Secretary Clinton that he was concerned, mainly because of what the WikiLeaks, what the cables suggested about his, activities and
there were more substantive and serious concerns. Yeah.
Were there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you name a
not
a person?
So
country.
I think you could see why, if the point of the conversation is someone raising concern about private conversations being made public, it wouldn't be helpful for me to then make those private conversations public in response to a question at this podium.
15 years ago. I'll drop it.
Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you. A couple of questions on Russia.
Yeah.
The multiple reports claiming that Russian government plane was headed to New York this morning. Are you in a position to confirm it? What are they doing there? It's the first time since last year.
I'm not able to confirm those reports. I don't have any information about it at all.
Take it from me if possible.
This is not the FAA, Alex. So
about the phone call between Moscow, between Russian and U.S. defense ministers. Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yesterday's phone call to Moscow. Why did the administration feel a need to make that phone call yesterday on the same day when ICC issued an arrest warrant?
Why did who feel the need to make a phone call?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the Secretary of Defense called.
It's a question you should direct to the Secretary of Defense or the Pentagon, not to the State Department.
But is there any change in the administration's policy in terms of discussing Ukraine without Ukraine?
There is, of course, there's not. But with respect to questions about calls made by other agencies, especially agencies that hold public briefings, you should go to their public briefings and ask them.
Do you have any concern about timing of it? Because yesterday
Of course not. Of course not.
On the South Caucasus, Assistant Secretary is headed to Azerbaijan. He was in Yerevan 2 weeks ago. He was in Georgia last month. Why having this visit separately to these capitals? You guys have.
We continue to engage in diplomacy to resolve a number of the outstanding issues in that region. It's something we've been working on for some time. The Assistant Secretary regularly travels there. Go ahead.
Thanks. There was a Hill hearing today that singled out China's growing influence in the hemisphere, specifically a megaport that's being built in Peru, set to launch later this year. Is State concerned about China's gaining a stronger foothold in the hemisphere, and what steps are you taking to counter?
So we have long understood and have spoken to this publicly, the fact that other countries are going to have relationships with China. They're going to have diplomatic relationships with China. They're going to have economic relationships with China. That is no different than the United States. We have diplomatic and economic relationships with China. What we have always made clear to countries around the world, and this very much includes countries in our own hemisphere, is that they need to go into those relationships eyes wide open, and they need to understand that if they enter into agreements with China, they ought to ensure that those agreements have transparency, that they are in the best interests of their governments, and most importantly in the people of their countries, and to make sure that they've fully meet international standards. Nadia.
Thank you. On Gaza, 500,000 people are facing catastrophic level of hunger, especially in the north, and actually WFP is describing the situation as full-blown famine. So what exactly are you doing to pressurize or persuade or cajole the Israelis to make sure that this is not going to happen and not materialize in actually a full famine?
So we continue to work day and night. Our special envoy for Middle East humanitarian issues is back in the region today after being back in Washington for consultations around Minister Gallant's visit. She's back in the region working on this exact issue today, trying to not just get humanitarian aid into Gaza, but most importantly, make sure it is distributed around Gaza. I think everyone's aware that that has been the chief impediment to actually getting food to the Palestinian people. It's not getting aid into the pier, it's not getting aid into Kerem Shalom, it's then making sure that it can be distributed from those points onward. We have had a number of discussions between, we have been involved in a number of discussions in the past few days between the various United Nations agencies and various components of the Israeli government to try to work through some security challenges that the UN is currently facing. To deliver humanitarian assistance. We continue to push to try to resolve their legitimate concerns about the safety and security of their personnel, and are continuing to push to try to work through some asks that they have on the table pending with the government of Israel to try to make it safer for their personnel to take humanitarian assistance and deliver it around to the people of Gaza.
That was my follow-up, actually, because the UN said that
I anticipated
Israel,
that.
I read my mind.
Or
that Israel. So, do you believe that actually the Israelis can improve the way that the UN agencies, especially their workers, are delivering the aid? It could be met.
Yeah, there are a number of things that Israel can do. I spoke to some of them yesterday. Some of them is to allow protective personal equipment for UN workers. Some is to kind of increase communications between the IDF and COGAT and UN workers. And then there's some other things too that the UN workers have asked for that I'm not going to get into from this podium, but there is more that can be done. There are some of the requests where Israel has legitimate security concerns, and what we're trying to do is broker agreements that give the UN personnel the assurances they need that they can operate securely while still protecting Israel's legitimate security concerns.
One last question is, I'm sure you've seen these detailed reports that most of them have harrowing accounts of Palestinian prisoners being rounded up. Some of them are being sexually assaulted, shackled for hours, inhumane conditions, and that's the description of Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem and others, and witnesses who are actually a part of the IDF who came and talked about what happened. So you often call Israel as an ally who you shared values with. So how can the United States make sure that these things, which is obviously unacceptable for most democracies, that is not allowed to happen? What exactly are you doing? What the mechanism that you're using to make sure that this is not happening, and if you're investigating it yourself?
So with respect to any investigations, there are, as I've said before, a number of incidents that we are reviewing when it relates to potential human rights abuses, potential violations of the laws of war, and I'm not going to speak to any particular incident from here, but there are a number of incidents where we have reviews ongoing. But that said, separate and apart from that, we have made clear to Israel that we fully expect them to comply with all human rights laws, international laws of war. That includes the treatment of prisoners and detainees. And when there are abuses, those ought to be investigated. If accountability is appropriate, there ought to be accountability, and we'll continue to make that clear then. Sure. Who was that? Who asked the question?
Yeah, I wanted to follow on that.
And I would say that's the last time today I'm going to do without raising hand, but go ahead.
Oh, I apologize. It was a follow on her. On investigation of the use of Palestinians as human shields, or video that was on social media today about Israeli forces using attack dogs. You talk about investigations. Logistically, what does an investigation look like, and when would we see results of that type of investigation?
So it depends whose investigation you're speaking to. If you mean the reviews that are going on by the United States, there are personnel inside the State Department that conduct reviews with respect to the laws of war in this conflict, as we do in other places around the world. And I don't speak to those reviews before they're finalized, nor can I preview when they would be finished. But just to speak to some of the complexity that we face in launching those reviews, and it's the same complexity I face sometimes in answering questions about this from the podium. So yesterday, Doctors Without Borders put out a statement saying that a doctor who was a member of Doctors Without Borders was killed by an IDF strike while I believe on his way to work inside Gaza. I was asked about it at the podium. I said, I can't give you an assessment on that strike because I don't know the details. Hours later, the IDF put out a statement saying that that particular doctor was also a terrorist member of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, who was a member of a participant in their rocket program. I don't have the ability to litigate that claim. We don't, at first blush, often have the ability to litigate claims made by the different parties in this conflict. And so I know sometimes when I'm asked to pronounce judgment, it's frustrating that we can't do it. But the incident yesterday is the exact situation why oftentimes in the middle of a conflict, it is difficult to draw definitive conclusions when there is conflicting information that we all face. So I will say, as it pertains to our reviews, we collect information from all the relevant parties. As we said when we released a report on this matter some time ago, we have open inquiries to the government of Israel asking for information about these specific incidents, and we'll continue. Those reviews will continue.
Sorry, on this though, do you have any reason to believe that the IDF claim is more credible than the MSF claim?
So both things can be true. What MSF claimed was that he was a doctor who was a member of MSF.
Okay.
What Israel claimed is that
that's wrong?
No, I'm not saying that's wrong. What Israel claimed is that he was a doctor who was a member of MSF who was also a terrorist involved in Palestinian Islamic Jihad's rocket program. My point is, neither of those are United States verified information.
Right,
so when I get asked about
the IDF claim, but he was a doctor and he was also involved in Hamas's missile program?
Rocket program.
Rocket
program.
Yeah?
Yeah.
How?
I don't know. That goes to my.
Didn't the IDF tell you?
They put out a statement on this. This goes to my exact point that you see claims made by various parties on the ground, and then oftentimes you see conflicting claims made by the IDF. We will reach out to our Israeli partners about. We will reach out to our Israeli partners for more information about these, but oftentimes when I'm asked for definitive conclusions about the specifics of a strike, we are operating on incomplete information, and that's why, as frustrating as it is why I can't offer a definitive conclusion about any one strike.
There are plenty of instances in history where physicians have been, also criminals of some kind.
That's my point. Yeah.
But you're just saying, well, MSF, which is a respectable organization, IDF, a respectable organization, but they have completely different views. So you guys need to come in the middle and decide what,
And that's,
don't you?
That is what we do with respect to the ongoing assessments. That's the point I was making, 2 points I was making. One, with respect to ongoing assessments, when you look at that information environment, sometimes that's why it takes time to reach a definitive conclusion, because things aren't as simple as they appear at first blush, right? I get a question about
Well,
it. Hold on, I get a question about it yesterday.
No,
I
it
know.
could be as simple as they were at first blush. You just don't.
Exactly right, and you don't know. The second thing is that's why it's hard oftentimes to give definitive answers when I get asked about this from the podium, because information changes, more information comes to light, and maybe that information is correct, maybe it's not. We try to gather it and make definitive determinations.
But Matt, don't you make assessment to other countries when you don't have equally the same information? Whether it's Iran, whether it is China, whether even an ally, Russia or Ukraine or others. So is it just with Israel that you're always unable to make that conclusive results, or is it just because you don't have the information?
So first of all, I would say there are times when it is quite obvious what happened, and we do make specific determinations very quickly. So look at the World Central Kitchen strike, where it's quite obvious within a few hours, within certainly the first 24 hours, what happened and that it was a mistaken strike, and we spoke to that exactly. Other times, it is less clear. So that's the first thing. But then I would say, with respect to Israel, as with any other country, we make determinations based on the information that's available to us. We reach out, in this case, to NGOs and others who are on the ground, and we reach out to the government of Israel when trying to make assessments about individual strikes before making any definitive conclusions.
But you do accept at least what both sides agree on, that this person was a doctor.
I have no reason to dispute that. I have no reason to dispute at all that he was a doctor.
And to be clear, sorry.
Yeah.
And
That's funny.
sorry, no laughing matter. But and to be clear, you have explicitly asked Israel for evidence that this doctor was involved in Hamas.
I don't know if we have pertains to this strike. We often do.
Will you?
Hold on a second. We often do when it comes to strikes like these, when there are claims of human rights abuses or claims of civilian casualties. It is regular practice for us to do so through our embassy in Jerusalem. I can't say we've done so in this case, but it would be normal practice for us to have done so. I just haven't verified that we did in this one specific one, or that we're not doing it in the coming days, but it would be our standard practice to do so, yes.
Can we move to Kenya?
Sure.
I'm sure we can move back later. So, according to the White House, the administration has been in touch with the Kenyan government after the shootings of protesters yesterday. You expressed concern about the violence, but since then, the Kenya has withdrawn the bill that was being discussed. Is that something that the U.S. sort of pushed for or welcomes?
So I won't speak to the withdrawing of the bill. That ultimately is a matter for the Kenyan government to determine. I will say that in our conversations with the Kenyan government, what we did is tell them that the freedom of peaceful assembly and habeas corpus are rights that are enshrined in the Kenyan Constitution, and we urge them to ensure that the Kenyan security forces use non-lethal methods and prevent civilian harm in responding to any security concerns.
Yesterday, I think in the White House comments today, that it talked about reports of violence against protesters. It sounds like you have a little bit more of a solid conclusion. Like, do you have an understanding of what actually happened?
Yeah, we've seen well-documented reports of violence against protesters, and what we have said is in our conversation with the Kenyan government is that they should use non-lethal methods and prevent civilian harm in dealing with peaceful protests.
And this is the same country that has obviously sent police to Haiti for this multinational security support mission. Does that raise concerns to you about if you've got those particular concerns about how Kenyan security forces are operating, inside their country, should we be concerned about how they're going to operate now in Haiti?
So a few things with respect to that. Number one, all MSS mission personnel, both from Kenya and from other countries that we expect to participate in the MSS, receive pre-deployment training. That is in accordance with UN training standards for similar UN missions, including training on human rights, child protection, countering sexual and gender-based violence. We've also worked with Kenya and other partners to integrate critically important accountability and oversight measures in accordance with the authorizing UN Security Council resolution. And that includes operating in the highest standards of transparency, conduct, and discipline, and includes compliance mechanisms to prevent, investigate, address, and publicly report any violations or abuses of human rights related to the MSS mission. So we have both, working with the UN and others, worked to establish training on the front end and then to ensure transparency and accountability for any alleged abuses on the back end should they occur.
Who has oversight over that mission?
The United Nations, ultimately. It's a United Nations Security Council authorized mission. Shannon.
Also in Kenya, President Ruto claimed that organized crime groups infiltrated those protests. Is that a claim that they've also repeated in your private conversations? And also, do you see any validity that happened?
So I'm not going to speak to private conversations, and I can't assess the validity of that or not. I would say, in addition to the point I made about restraint by Kenyan security forces, we do urge Kenyan protesters not to put anyone, including government officials, in harm's way. Protests should remain peaceful in Kenya, as they should remain peaceful all around the world. Yeah, Peter.
This morning, the Secretary released the 2023 International Religious Freedom Report, where there's a considerable chapter on Iran. Today is also the International Day in support of victims of torture, torture is rampant in Iranian jails, per your own annual reports on human rights in Iran. On Tuesday, yesterday, a group of political prisoners in Iran, they asked that the world pay more attention to the human rights situation in Iran, especially in view of the recent comment by Ali Khamenei that among the officials of the judiciary system, he was saying, ignore international or Western, quote unquote, Western human rights standards, and only national laws apply. Now, I was wondering, besides sanctions against Iranian officials, what other alternatives do you have to try to secure Iranian people's human rights?
So, first of all, we absolutely agree that the world should pay more attention to the oppression of the Iranian people. And one of the things that we have done since the outset of this administration is to work to highlight human rights abuses inside Iran, highlight crackdowns on the freedom of the Iranian people. And we do that not just through our bilateral engagements around the world. We do it through public reports that we issue. You referred to one of them. And we also do it working through international fora, where we consistently raise the regime's brutal crackdown and brutal repression of the Iranian people, and encourage other countries to raise their voices and object to it publicly and object to it privately. We also take measures to ensure that the Iranian people can stay connected to the outside world. We've talked before, you've heard me talk before from this podium about what we have done to ensure that they have access to the internet through VPNs, so the Iranian people can find out from independent news sources outside Iran more about what their government is doing. And then I do think the measures that we impose, the accountability measures that we impose, are important. We have imposed more than, I believe it's 600 sanctions and other measures on Iran and Iran-related entities since the outset of this administration. Some of those are for their support for terrorism and other destabilizing actions, but a number of them are for their oppression of the Iranian people, and we will continue to take those actions as appropriate.
But Matt, sanctions are not helping people.
Well, so my point, sanctions are just one of the tools in our arsenal, ultimately calling out that oppression, making sure other countries focus on it, and we wish more countries would. Let's be perfectly frank. It would be, we would welcome other countries objecting to the brutal crackdowns of the Iranian people. We see some, of course, and to that statement, yes, a lot of them are in the Western world. We would welcome every country in the world speaking out against Iran's brutal crackdowns. And as I said, we also work to support the Iranian people, and those are the measures that we have available to us, and we will continue to use them.
Well, clearly they're not going to listen, as Khamenei has said, to.
I certainly don't think the regime in Tehran is going to listen, but as I said, we're going to continue to try to make sure the Iranian people can also get information from outside sources, and we support the Iranian people in their rights to exercise their freedom of expression and other basic rights available to them. Go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. Staying on the religious. In your report, in the Iraqi section, it says that restrictions on freedom of religion remained widespread outside of Kurdistan, but in some parts of the Iraq. And also, there are continual reports of violence by the armed groups, sectarian groups, like Iranian-backed groups on the religious minority in Iraq, especially in Sinjar, the people, Yazidi people, they fear to go back to their region because of these groups. So what tools and what measures do you have and have you put in place against these groups in order to take
So-
their responsibility?
So first of all, when it comes to the report that we released today, I'm not going to be able to give you a detailed answer as pertains to what's in the report. It's a long, detailed report, covers scores of countries around the world, and I'm not an expert who can speak to every piece of information that was in the report. I will say the report itself is the point of the report itself is to make information public. It is not it is not the vehicle through which we impose accountability measures. It is the vehicle that informs the policy choices that we make. So it is one of the things that we do to gather information, to make that information public, and then we take into account all the information that's in the report to inform the policy choices, none of which I'm going to preview from here.
Another question on the Kurdistan region. After long postponement, today the Kurdistan region President Najm Barzani sets October 20th as the new date for the Kurdistan region's election. As the U.S. government were engaged and so encouraged the Kurdistan region to schedule a date for that election. So what's your comment on that? And how do you see the process of preparation for that election and also the recent change to the election in that region?
So we welcome the announcement of parliamentary elections on October 20th in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Elections are a vital element